Copilot, in a way, we built this for ourselves. So we can make our own engineers, that are our own developers that are building developer tools a little bit more productive, a little bit more, satisfied, fulfilled, and ultimately more happy, because we truly at GitHub believe that happy developers are the ones that are building the most amazing things, whether it's in open source or in intellectual property.
Hello, I'm Adrian Hinchcliffe, and welcome to this edition of ITWeb on the Road. I'm joined today by Thomas Dohmke, CEO of GitHub, who's on a flying visit to South Africa. As he's here, because the role of software development only continues to grow in importance to business and society, we thought it would be a great opportunity to have a chat to you about what's going on at GitHub, but also about the kind of wider software industry and what's happening there. Thomas, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk to you today.
Cool. That's all right. So I imagine many of our viewers will know what GitHub is. Probably many of them will use it. But perhaps for those that don't, can you give us like the elevator pitch? What is GitHub? What services does it offer? Who's its users? And maybe how many users? Those kind of ideas.
GitHub is the place where, the world's developers, the world's nerds, if you will, are working together to build software, whether it's in the open, what we call open source, where all the source code, all the ideas, all the changes they're making are seen in public and can be used by other developers for their own ideas or to contribute back, or whether it's in companies and enterprises and startup working on their own intellectual property on private repositories. So millions of developers, in fact, more than 100 million developers are working together on GitHub on their software projects, sharing their source code, sharing their ideas, building those applications. And for the last 3 years now, also with GitHub Copilot, leveraging large language models or AI to build that software even faster and be happy doing it.
Okay. So I think the first thing I wanted to touch on is skills. So I read that Evans data or statistics say that there's 26.4 million developers across the world, and local estimates are there's about 120,000 in South Africa. So globally, I think we've kind of experienced an increase in demand for software development skills, but obviously the supply has been lacking. I think we've found some solutions in terms of low code, no code. Obviously AI is having an impact, but with kind of AI, are we in danger of overcompensating? Does it spell trouble for developers? Or is it solving a skills gap? Is it bridging that hole? Or is it, the end game is in sight?
I don't think we are in danger at all. Like if I look at, GitHub or we are part of Microsoft, if Microsoft as a whole, we have way too many ideas in our backlogs. We have way too much customer feedback. We have product managers that come up with new features or new user interfaces, new co-pilots every single day. And so we have that innovation backlog that's ever growing. And I often joke that, the only time that backlog is empty is when you delete it all and start fresh to not have all that baggage in your back pocket that's dragging you down. On the other side, most software companies that have gone through, a few months really, or maybe quarters or years, have also a backlog of what's called tech debt, legacy code, code that has been built in a rush and now no longer scales to the needs of the size of the customer base, regulatory requirements, and privacy, and responsible AI regulation, and security, accessibility, all these things that are also part of developers' backlog and that are fundamental for customers to keep trusting, the company that's providing the software. And so you have those two backlogs. Most developers prefer to spend the time here in the innovation side to build new stuff, and most companies require them to also work on that backlog because otherwise, once you lose customer trust, it's much harder to earn it back. And so developers constantly have to balance those two backlogs, or we use AI to bring the effort down for both of these things, making coding easier, more enjoyable. Whether it's as simple as having Copilot auto-completion, suggesting the next line or multiple lines of code, or whether it's chat explaining code to you, or whether it's on that technical debt of having automatically fixed security vulnerabilities, adding, accessibility tags to your HTML pages, those kind of things. So we think, developers will become more productive, and they will still have way too much work and way too many ideas to ever run out of run out of backlog.
Okay. So then maybe looking at Africa. I mean, obviously you're here on a visit. So I was looking on social media earlier today, and there was a video of one of your dashboards, and it's really kind of impressive stuff, all kind of flashing lights in. I'm sure you know it better than I do. But it shows all the kind of deployments going on around the world. Given that you've got that kind of level of data, what are you seeing for GitHub use in Africa? Are there certain countries that are surprising you with adoption? Perhaps there's African use cases that differ from elsewhere in the world. What's your take there?
So we see fast growth in countries like Nigeria or Egypt, where not only is the number of developers growing, they're also growing faster than elsewhere in the world. Here in South Africa, we have over 660,000 developers on GitHub. That number is higher than the 120,000 that you mentioned earlier, because there's obviously a lot of hobbyists, a lot of students that don't become a professional developer and as such don't count in some of those statistics, but are still, excited about building hobby projects, whether it's little web pages, for their sports club, or whether it's, working on software that's powering home automation, all the way to doing embedded stuff with an Arduino or Raspberry Pi. And so we see 660,000 open source developers here in South Africa, growing 25% year over year. So we're adding, 25% of 660,000, we'll see what it is next year, 150, 180,000 or so new developers in the next 12 months. And in fact, if we look at developers working on AI project, we see even higher growth in the 45% range. And I think that shows you how much excitement there is even, in Africa about this new world of both open source development and AI software development.
Okay. And I think one thing that kind of characterizes Africa versus perhaps the rest of the world is that I think we're probably a mobile-first continent. So I think some statistic I found is 51% of all web traffic in Africa comes from mobile. What are you seeing in that regard? Are kind of people using GitHub from mobile devices? Is that more true in Africa, or are you seeing that it's kind of more equally balanced? What's your take there?
I don't have statistics on the top of my head of what mobile usage looks in South Africa, but I know that our mobile app, the GitHub mobile app, is used by over 1 million users on a monthly basis. And more importantly, if we look at the evolution of software development with the help of AI, which means you can use natural language in almost any major human language, whether it's English, whether it's German, whether it's Afrikaans, you can use that to build features. And in fact, that works actually nicer on mobile phones than coding itself, because for coding you often need curly braces and colons, and they're only a submenu of your keyboard and harder to type on the small screen. And so with the help of Copilot and a product that we announced a year ago, and that is now in a wide preview called Copilot Workspace, you can take an idea, and with the help of different agents that help you, go through the software development process, writing the specification, planning out which files you have to change, implementing those changes, even fixing, mistakes that were done during its own implementation, all the way to submitting the code for code review with your coworkers or the maintainers of an open source project. You can go through all of these steps on your mobile phone. You can just say, open this in Workspace. It lines out, what is the current behavior, what is the intended behavior. And of course, we need the human at the center because most of our ideas are not complete enough to just be implemented all the way through. You want to be in the control. You want to iterate with the agent, with the Copilot and modify, some of the proposals it makes. We have a brainstorming mode even where it gives you ideas what else you could add to the specification, and then shows you what files to modify. You might say, add some test cases because my manager needs me to write tests to have the quality assurance all the way, to finish the product. And you can even deploy to the cloud straight from your mobile phone.
Okay, sure. So I think obviously AI is kind of playing a big role then in that mobile uptake.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So a couple of years ago, we saw that ChatGPT hit the headlines, and that's kind of obviously generative AI has kind of made the world aware of what AI is capable of. I know GitHub's Copilot was kind of around before that. You said 3 years ago. So how has that been integrated? How has AI been integrated into GitHub? What capabilities does it offer? I mean, I think you touched on some of them. And how's it evolving? How do you see it evolving over the next few years?
We started working on Copilot in June of 2020, so 4 years ago. And we had early access to the GPU-3 model, which was the state of the art at that time. We played, with some fonts, and we realized that it's able to drive the code. We then partnered with Microsoft and OpenAI to fine-tune that GPT-3 model into a variant called Codex. And that's what the original Copilot launched on in June 2021. So that was about a year and a half before ChatGPT. And at the time, the state of the art was that you could use this Copilot for auto completion. As you would type in your editor on every keystroke, we would run model inference, and it would predict, the next word, maybe the next line, but often also multiple lines of codes, an algorithm like, calculating a prime number or, downloading something off the internet, all the way to generating full test cases because it knew what you had written before in the file. So it had the context of the file and adjacent tabs in your editor available to it. And then came ChatGPT a year and a half later. At that point, Copilot was already a in production product that customers could buy. But ChatGPT changed the mindset of many customers. It changed, it opened the eyes of many managers and software developers of what AI is now capable. And with the check interface, it opened a whole new way of interacting with Copilot, because now in Copilot Check, you could ask it specific questions. And you could ask it to write code for you. You could also ask it to explain code to you. You could ask it to explain, an underlying security vulnerability, or, how you fix that vulnerability. And all of a sudden you had a full AI pair programmer that's always available to you, that, has infinite patience, doesn't judge you, or you don't have to worry about that it might judge you. And so we went from auto completion to chat. And now we are today in a world of agents, where you have larger building blocks available to you. They're not autonomous. We don't have to worry about them. We're still controlling them by telling them what to do. And then they're writing the code for us, or they're writing the fix for a security vulnerability for us, and by automatically scanning, the output of our code review for us. So I don't have to wait for my coworker, to wake up in a different time zone and look at my code and say, Thomas, what did you do there? Like, why didn't you find that yourself? I have AI available to me, Copilot available to me to scan my code for quality issues and for vulnerability issues. And so I think we're going to go further on that journey of making software development easier to learn, because if I can ask questions, I can also evolve my thinking about things if I don't understand a certain construct, but also, taking solving for developers the things that they don't want to do, so they have more time, to focus on the things they love doing, and that's often, writing code in a creative fashion.
Okay. I mean, you're talking there about helping perhaps people like myself who aren't from a development background learning more.
Yep.
What else are you doing to address that skill shortage? I mean, you're kind of obviously walking some people through it, but how are you kind of helping attract more people to your platform, and how are you helping grow your community from perhaps the less geeky members of society?
From our perspective, it all starts with, open source providing access for anyone to read code, to understand code, to ask questions about code, to take, the project of whether it's a coworker, whether it's a co-student, whether it's, a link that somebody sent to you and say, check this out. And often, many coding projects not only come with the programming language, the code that's implemented in it, but also with a README file and a wiki that provides additional information. That has always been, the foundation of what GitHub is, or what we call social coding, that many developers, millions of developers around the world can work together, that have never met, that don't know each other, that don't know their educational background. Is truly, the largest team sport on earth. In many ways, the one thing where we as humans can agree to work together and not argue about politics and other things. Now with Copilot, it's a whole new level because, of course, now you can not only take the open source code, the repository of GitHub, but you can also ask Copilot questions about that. And you can ask those questions, in your mother tongue. You don't have to learn English first. And if most people on this planet do not speak English, while the software industry is predominantly English. And so it opens and it removes the barrier of entry for learning about software development. It removes the requirement of having somebody at home or in your work environment that can answer questions for you. Like if you're, a 6-year-old that wants to learn coding and you may have access to, a mobile phone or tablet or even a computer, but your parents don't have a computer science, computer engineering background, it's really hard to go through the first steps because who's there to help you? Or the Copilot will be, I believe the Copilot will be that tool. You can, open it on any device. You can ask it any question in any language, and it will give you answers. And I think kids will, and most humans will sooner or later understand that when they get the wrong answer, it's totally okay to ask another question. And I think the core skill, other than understanding how these AI models work and how to use a Copilot, is to have used it enough to detect what is a hallucination, what's the wrong output, or how do I validate that output. And you can actually, ask the model specifically when it comes to coding, to also validate that what it just gave to you as an answer is actually the correct answer.
Okay. I think one thing mentioned there was around politics. So yeah, we're not going to go down the red hat angle, but I noticed that Copilot also, I don't know whether you do or you're it's on the roadmap to support Anthropic and Google Gemini. So how does that work in practice? Obviously, as a Microsoft-backed company, is there any kind of politics there? And as a developer using it, how does it work in practice for me? Do I have to pick one and stick with it, or can I interchange, or are they all integrated into one?
We recently had our yearly conference called GitHub Universe, and at that conference we announced exactly what you said. We call this multi-model choice. We want to give developers the choice of what model they want to use in Copilot, because we fundamentally, as GitHub, believe that choice is important for every developer. We don't tell you what programming language to use. We don't tell you what open source framework to use. And there's often, multiple open source frameworks doing the same thing, but following a different approach. We're not telling you what cloud or hyperscaler you should use. And as such, what editor, what IDE. And as such, we also believe that you should have the choice of what model to use. And it works today quite simply in Copilot chat. In the chat panel, you have a drop-down menu and you can pick a model between the OpenAI 4.0 model, the new O1 preview and O1 mini model, and in preview right now, the Anthropic Claude 3.5 Sonnet model, and soon Google Gemini 1.5 Pro. And I think, developers, whether it's through a company policy where, company management prescribes a model, give it contracts, or legal reviews they have gone through, whether it's through benchmarks that you have read on the internet, whether you just want to try out the latest model because there's always a new model these days, every week or so, or whether it's because you have understood the weaknesses and strengths of each individual model, whether you know how fast, for example, the 4.0 model is from OpenAI in streaming a response to you, versus the O1 model, which has advanced listening capabilities, but it may take a couple of minutes to get to the response. And, every time a developer waits, they do something else, whether it's grabbing a coffee or engaging in social media or just chatting with their team. Every distraction is interrupting you in your flow, and flow is so important for creativity. That's really, if you think about the power of the original Copilot, was that I could just type in my editor, and whenever I needed, didn't know something, it would give me a suggestion. And even if that suggestion isn't perfect, it often is way better than switching from my editor to the browser, opening a tab. And most of us have lots of tabs already open that are a reflection of our lives, both professionally and personally, and then the world news and politics and whatnot. And then I open a new tab and I go, on a search engine, and I ultimately land on a platform like GitHub or Reddit or Stack Overflow, and I find a response there. But by the time I'm back in my editor, 20 minutes have passed, and I might have, engaged in an argument with another developer what is actually the better answer. And I still have to make that code work for me in the editor. And as such, Copilot AI keeps you in the flow, whether it's with just auto completion or whether it's in the chat panel. And so it will be crucial for developers to understand, coming back to the 4.0 or one example, what is the right model for the right job? If you just need to change the background color, you probably are not well advised to use an O1 model that takes 2 minutes to calculate it in the bad new background color. You can just do that yourself or use a very fast, very small model, and vice versa. If you have to solve a very complex, refactoring of multiple files, a more complex model gets the job done while the smaller model might, interrupt its own code creation halfway through the process.
Okay. So talk me through, obviously you're using large language models. And I'm not a developer yet, so I'm showing my ignorance. World to see. It's not the first time. But talk me through the ethics around the kind of training models. Where are those co-pilots or the co-pilots kind of AIs getting that information from to kind of build their generative AI models themselves? And how have you as GitHub looked at that from an ethical point of view? And if, I don't know, the repositories, all the code's kind of background's been provided by the open source community, do they have a right to kind of be aware of that? Are they compensated for that? How does that work?
Yeah. So the models, especially now that we have multiple model providers in Copilot, are trained by each model company. Each model company, like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, or Microsoft, through the Phi models, smaller language models, but still they're trained on different data sets, publicly available data sets, licensed data sets, and of course, open source code. I think it's a common misconception that they're just trained on all that data together. Instead, each of these companies are investing into large efforts to label data and qualify whether it's a good data or bad data for training. And only a subset of the data is actually used for training, and the remaining data is used to evaluate the trained model. And then when we integrate these models into, GitHub Copilot or really any Microsoft Copilot or the Azure OpenAI API, we're going through what we call responsible AI processes, where the model is, tested and secured from ethical considerations, from legal considerations, from privacy and security, all things that are important for us as a company. We run on trust, but also as a society, where we don't want to create models that users use and get output that is offensive to them or goes direction of illegal output. And then when the model is integrated into the product, every input that is sent to the model is scanned, and every output that's coming back from the model is scanned. And so, for example, for Copilot, the code that is generated by the model is in fact scanned for security vulnerabilities, and as such, the code that is landing in your chat window or in your editor has a higher security level. The average is raised, by that constant scanning, and also we are validating, we're checking whether that code already exists in a public repository in GitHub. So regardless of what the license is, on GitHub, if there's public code and the code is coming out of a Copilot, we're checking if that code already exists. And there's two modes that individual developers and enterprises can enable. One is blocking all the matches, and so the Copilot will not repeat code that is already out there. Or you can, and that's new. We shipped that this year. You can show the references, and so it shows you, similar to when you ask the question in Copilot or ChatGPT that uses a web search. It shows you the references where that code is already known, and that is really useful for developers, because then they can make the choice: do I actually want to take that code from Copilot and paste it into my editor, or do I want to look into these open source libraries, and instead of just taking the code snippet, I embed the open source library into my application, and as such, whenever the open source maintainer then updates that library, I benefit from these updates.
Okay. So then to switch gear, switch lane.
Yeah.
I think you were at Microsoft. We were discussing before we started that you've been at Microsoft for a couple of years before the acquisition took place. So I think a lot of people at the time, and I'm sure you were kind of at the very center of that, were asking what Microsoft was doing. I know that it was kind of always seen as being proprietary technology, was kind of anti-open source, perhaps historically. So given that you've lived through that transition, can you kind of give reasons why Microsoft kind of bought GitHub and what it was like at the time? How did the open source community react? And has that changed? How has you find that's changed over, 8 years?
So I joined 6 years. I joined Microsoft in late 2014, so almost 10 years ago. Now it's November, I'm recording this. I joined GitHub in October 2018, so a bit more over 6 years ago. And in early 2018, the acquisition process started. In June 2018, we announced the acquisition. October, we closed. And if you look into, back to 2018, what position was Microsoft in? But we already had a large open source presence. In fact, if you go back and look at statistics, Visual Studio Code, Microsoft's open source editor, was already one of the open source projects in GitHub with the most contributions. Microsoft had open source.net. It had contributed to many open source projects. It was involved in open source foundations. But of course, with the announcement, with every large mergers and acquisitions announcement, there was excitement, but there was also skepticism around what would Microsoft do with GitHub. And as such, I was part of the deal team, and in the deal team at Microsoft, we defined 3 very clear principles for how we want to run GitHub in the future. And the first one was that GitHub is independent, and we always put the developer first. So we don't put, enterprises first, and we don't put marketing first, and we don't put, the commercial interests of Microsoft first. We're putting the developer first in every product we design and every process internally. Everybody at GitHub is using GitHub to build GitHub on GitHub, and including our legal team, our HR team, and of course, our product and engineering teams. And the second one is that we wanted Microsoft to accelerate GitHub, and that has worked out in many different ways. One, and that our revenue growth has accelerated. In July of this year, we announced that GitHub is now at a $2 billion annual revenue run rate. And so while, GitHub still is independent, if you go to GitHub today, it still looks like GitHub. It doesn't have a Microsoft logo on it. We don't sell any Microsoft services. We support any cloud, any platform, any device. And you as developer have the choice of what you want to do. We already mentioned the multi-modal choice in an earlier question. And then lastly, we wanted GitHub to accelerate Microsoft. And I think actually Copilot is the perfect example of that, where the GitHub team in 2020 leveraging the partnership between Microsoft OpenAI, and so as such, the second principle comes back into play. Microsoft accelerated GitHub by establishing their partnership with OpenAI and giving us early access, and then GitHub took that model and built the first Copilot and named the first Copilot. But we very quickly after we had gone through the ideation process, gone to our partners in Azure and say we need to build, the infrastructure for running a product like Copilot around the world, scaling, on thousands of NVIDIA GPUs, building that responsible AI stack, and what ultimately has become the Azure OpenAI API that any third-party developer and, all the teams at Microsoft building Copilots are using now for their model inference. And it, of course, no longer just supports OpenAI models, even on the Azure AI services. We also have the Meta Llama models and the Mistral models, more than 1,500 models in the model catalog. And so, ultimately we contributed the name Copilot back to Microsoft. And so that's how now today at Microsoft, all these, agentic AI systems are called Copilot.
Okay. I think you're talking an excellent technology game. And some of it's going over my head, if I'm honest. But from like a business point of view, what are the top strategic challenges that you face at GitHub? What are your kind of top 3 issues that you've got to be working on over the next year, 2 years?
I don't know if I have 3.
Top 2 then.
Yeah. I think, the number one challenge for us as GitHub is the same challenge as every software company has, which is we have way too many ideas. We have limited resources available to us, even in a large company like Microsoft that has, large revenue streams and a huge number of employees. We're still dealing with a finite budget. And I think, prioritizing what is the next big thing that we wanted to build, what is the bets we are taking, what is the customer feedback we are addressing, where do we go from a strategic perspective? That is the biggest challenge for us at GitHub, for me as a CEO of GitHub, making those decisions. And I don't get to have an A/B test. The decisions I make today or the ones we made 3 years ago when we launched Copilot, we can turn back time and decide, we take a different path and see how that works out for us. So I think that's the fundamental problem that every tech company has. And now if you look at software development, to go to number 2, and then let's see if I can come up with a third one. But I think, the problem is we always have too much work and it takes too long. It feels like, I go, to my engineering and product team and say, we need this feature because I heard in a customer conversation here in South Africa, that's the one feature that the customer need. And then they will buy our product. And then, the team tells me, Scotty tells Captain Kirk, it takes, 6 months to build this. And then Captain Kirk says, I want the warp drive repaired in 3 days, and then Scotty says, okay, I can do it in 2 hours, right? Like sadly, that last part never happens, and things just take a long time because software systems of any company that has been in market for a while, that has found product market fit, that has sold the product to customers, is very complex. It's easy to start fresh, with a new project while you're still working on what we call in the industry on a green field. But as soon as you have, found a customer base and you have grown your product, you're dealing with a highly complex system that constantly, evolves, and it's hard to modify just one piece of it and not also consider all the other pieces where that modification has an impact. And as such, Copilot, in a way, we built this for ourselves. So we can make our own engineers, that are our own developers that are building developer tools a little bit more productive, a little bit more, satisfied, fulfilled, and ultimately more happy, because we truly at GitHub believe that happy developers are the ones that are building the most amazing things, whether it's in open source or in intellectual property. And then I think, the third thing is that the industry is constantly evolving, right? There isn't stable state in software development. And if I started coding in the early 90s on a Commodore 64, and at the time you had to understand the intricacies you had to learn BASIC to even load a game. It was load like load, 8,1 or something like that. From a floppy disk, and developers of those systems then had to understand, when do I need multiple floppy disks, when do I load pieces the next level from the floppy disk all the way down to the machine code, because that was the only way that you could actually create software that is fast and animated and visually inspiring. We went, from that to the internet, which, allowed developers not only to collaborate, but also share all their work as open source, to thousands of open source libraries, to a world where we're now living, on top of container technology, which sits on top of cloud technology, which sits on top of, server thousands, millions of servers and data centers that we don't even understand or know what they are anymore. Certainly most developers don't have seen those servers because they don't get to go into those data centers. And so we have always gone up that abstraction ladder. And I think that, is the challenge for any software company. And certainly for us at GitHub, is when do we move further upwards? When do we, leave the intricacies of systems behind? And when do we still have to go down, deep in the technical stack to solve that one issue that, brings the system down or makes it slow or causes, an unexpected behavior for one of our customers.
Okay. I'd like to ask you one last question, if I can.
Yeah.
So I think security is obviously a kind of major concern as the world becomes more software focused, or software centric. So I think there's one part is around the fact that how do you rely on the community to not, someone in the community, a bad actor, to not inject malicious code? And then the other is, there's been a report around, I think it's GoIssue it's called, which is a phishing tool which is targeting GitHub users. What's your thoughts around security, keeping your user base safe, keeping your code safe?
Yeah. So we're a three-pronged approach to that. Number one is we want to secure our own platform. GitHub needs to be secure. We want to prevent from attackers being successful in phishing attacks, but also, attacking, our servers, our infrastructure. And as such, we have a security team that constantly monitors the security of the platform, that works closely with Microsoft security cyber defense operations centers, sharing threat intelligence, observing, what's happening around the world. It sometimes feels like when you look into what these cyber centers look like, it feels like a spy movie, monitoring all these different situations. But they're not looking at video cameras. They're looking at actual real-time data from all these, data points that we're collecting on servers around the world. So that's number one, we're protecting our platform. And of course, part of that is spam protection, blocking accounts that are attempting to use GitHub for spam or for phishing or for other legal activities, but also, allowing, the health of the community, that, our maintainers, our users are following the code of conduct of GitHub and of open source projects, allowing the users, as on any social network, to follow the guidelines, and if they don't, then having abilities to block them and exclude them, from participation where they are disruptive to a project. Number two is that we have within our security team the GitHub Security Lab that actually is working constantly on identifying security issues in open source libraries and reports them to the maintainers in a confidential way. And so the maintainer can fix those issues in partnership with us, and we're making open source a little bit more secure. Now, obviously, we can only do so much as a single entity. And of course, Microsoft is also heavily investing into that through different activities. But more importantly, we're working very closely with foundations like OpenSSF to, find an industry-wide approach to the securing the software supply chain, working with, other foundations like the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, and of course with, governments around the world, to finding joint approaches on things like the software bill of material, or SBOM. So, a project comes with what all the pieces are that are included in that project. And if you're building a project on top of the multiple projects, you can combine all the SBOMs into your single bill of material. So we're very engaged there in the open source community by helping open source maintainers finding their vulnerabilities and, working with foundations on defining and ultimately executing a strategy that secures the software supply chain. And then lastly, we are having our own security products. With GitHub Advanced Security, we're offering enterprise customers to buy a solution for secret scanning, identifying tokens, passwords, service principals and code, and remove them and instead move them into a secure key vault. We have code scanning that helps you to identify security vulnerabilities in code. And with Copilot Autofix, we actually give you the fix as well. And that brings down, time to fix a found security vulnerability by more than a factor of 3. And so, our headline for this is found means fixed, because in the past, security tools have often just added more work to the backlog of a developer instead of, solving all these issues for them, so they can focus on the innovation. And then lastly, with Dependerboard and the dependency graph, we're helping open source and closed source developers to keep their open source dependencies up to date, because often that's how security vulnerabilities age over time as you are getting behind on updating your dependencies, and as such you're missing out on that one important fix in the middle of a version update. Sure. And you're putting your own product under risk of something that was already solved in the open source space. And so these three pillars together, we believe, will help both the ecosystem, the industry, and ultimately our customers to build more secure software.
Okay, Thomas, that's been great. Thank you so much. That's been Thomas Dohmke, who is the CEO of GitHub. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.